Welcome to 61D, the course where we teach you modern full-stack web development. My name is Aiden, and today we're going to be covering JavaScript. We're going to start with a little bit of an introduction to the JavaScript language before covering basic syntax, arrays, objects, and asynchronous code. All of these different chapters will both be chapters in the video and have timestamps in the description. If it's a lot to digest all at once, I'd highly recommend watching this video in little segments. Before we begin, know that this is not an introductory programming lecture in the sense that we're not going to cover programming concepts at a fundamental level. Instead, we're going to show you how you can implement common programming concepts in JavaScript and cover many JavaScript-specific language features. Also, make sure that you have your computer set up for JavaScript development. All the instructions on how to do this are in the setup assignment we have for the course, which will be linked in the description. And without further ado, let's begin and talk about why you have to learn JavaScript to do web development. The most important reason is that web browsers natively run JavaScript. There's no other language that they run. If you want to control the behavior of your web page and have custom logic, which controls what is displayed to users, what users are allowed to access, and you want any of that to happen within the browser itself, you have to write that within JavaScript. This limitation means that if you want to know full stack, which means both front end and back end, you have to know JavaScript for the front end. And now, if you're already learning JavaScript for the front end, you might as well use it in the back end, especially when you're learning. Unfortunately, modern technologies allow you to run JavaScript outside of a web browser, even if JavaScript wasn't initially developed for this purpose. The tool that allows us to do this is something called Node.js. Node.js is a runtime which allows you to execute JavaScript outside of the browser. There are other JavaScript runtimes besides Node.js. We're going to specifically be using a runtime called Bun because it supports TypeScript natively. But the general idea is that you have a distinction between JavaScript code, which is going to get executed inside of a web browser, and JavaScript code, which is going to get executed outside of a web browser, either locally on your device or in production in some kind of web server. So if you look at sort of the landscape of what you could use to develop a website, on the front end, everything is going to use JavaScript, and on the back end, JavaScript is a solid option, assuming that you don't have high-level performance constraints. Finally, it's important to note that although all of the core JavaScript features can execute both in the browser and in Node.js, there's a few differences to be aware of. To begin with, there's certain operations and certain APIs which are only supported in one environment or the other. For instance, in a web browser, there are web browser specific storage systems such as local storage, session storage, and cookies, and it only ever makes sense to access and manipulate these within a web browser, and therefore the APIs to do so are only implemented in a web browser. Similarly, JavaScript to manipulate the actual HTML and CSS on a web page is normally only implemented in a web browser. Things which require an elevated level of permission and security that you can't normally do in a web browser, such as access the device operating system or do more security sensitive features, normally are only supported in the backend in something like Node.js. And of course, the vast majority of functionality is supported in both. And with that, let's start coding. To start, go to the link in the description to get the starter code. Click on this little dropdown and copy the URL to clone the code locally. Open up whatever your terminal of choice is. In Mac OS, you can just use the default terminal, or on Windows, you should use PowerShell. Navigate to whatever your preferred place to store the starter code is, and just run git clone and paste that link. that will clone the repository. You can change directory into it. So it's lecture JavaScript. And then you can open it up in VS Code. If you have it configured, you can just use the terminal command, or you can open it manually. So let's get going. To start, open up the blank basic.js file. For all lectures, including this one, we'll have both blank files that you can use to code and follow along, and also files with all of the lecture code completely filled out already, so that if you're trying to copy and paste something or take a look at it, you don't have to copy and type out directly what I'm typing on my screen. You also are going to want to open up a new terminal window so that we can actually run our commands. And just make sure that you have bun installed again. You can just write bun. If you get some output like that, then you're all good. Change directory into our blank directory so that then we can run our file. And now we're ready to begin. First order of business is just covering comments. Very similarly to other languages, you can do a single line comment with 2 slashes or a multi-line comment with a slash and an asterisk. Now, for your first program, the first thing you want to do is just log something to the terminal. For that, similarly to how you might write print or system.out in Python and Java respectively, JavaScript, all you do is you say console.log, and then we can put in some string that we want to log with quotation marks, hello world. Save, optional semicolon, and then just write bun basic.js. And there you go, hello world. Next up, declaring variables. There's 2 different keywords you need to know for declaring variables. We have let, so we could say let age equal 21. Let is used for variables which are mutable or can change. So for this variable, we're allowed to say age plus equals 1 to increment it, and then we could afterwards console.log age like so, and then it will show up as 22. However, in many cases, we want to specify that we do not want a variable to change. So for example, we could say const for constant name equals Aiden. And now if I try to reassign this to something else, if I say name equals John, this should throw an error because we're not allowed to reassign a constant. As far as actual types of variables you can declare, we already covered 2. We have numbers and strings. It's also important to note that JavaScript does not make any distinction between things like integers or decimals. So they're just represented as numbers unless you need a very, very large number. And then there is actually a big int type, but that's not relevant for today. And then there's just a few more. You can set something to be a Boolean, which just means true or false. So we can say my bool equals true, or we could also set it to false. False. You can set something to be null. So my null equals null. This is normally if you're trying to deliberately say that something has no value associated with it. But there's also a type which is undefined. This normally means that you're trying to access something that doesn't exist, or you're trying to access some data which hasn't explicitly been set. And it still has no value the same way that null does, but typically it means that it doesn't mean that it deliberately has no value. It just means you're trying to access something that doesn't exist. So we can say my undefined equals undefined.